I'm sure you all thought I was going to come here and talk about project delivery and talk about risk and talk about all the stuff I always talk about. My qualification to be here today is none of that. My qualification for this presentation is I am old. Now, how many people here actually worked on a construction project in 1977? Yes, 2. And let's one more. By 1983, how many people here worked on a construction project? Okay. Well, you were 1983, weren't you? 84? 86. All right. Wow. All right. Okay. Yeah. All right. In any event. So, and I want to, the days of Futurist passed. So in 1977, when I started, that's the record I would have been listening to. That's the Moody Blues, Days of Future Past. And so I stole the title, I am the futurist from the past. It's really important to get together and have these kinds of conversations. It's really important to think about what's happening. It's really important to think about the future. We did this kind of thing. I mean, I remember when I first started out in 1977, 1978, I got very involved very early on in the construction industry. And I remember going to meetings, and I have records of those meetings, and we would talk about the state of the industry and what the future is. The difference is you would never have a group like this. You would have AGC, maybe, and you'd have contractors talking to contractors. You'd have AIA, architects talking to architects. You'd have lawyers talking. And 2 things I can tell you about those meetings: everybody in this industry who was not in that meeting was the enemy. So it was your group versus everybody else. You talk about the future, you talk about innovations, but it was not something like this. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go through a little exercise with you today, and I'm going to take you back. What if this event was actually taking place in 1977? Yeah, okay. You know what? I thought I'd be able to use this. I can't. It's too small because it's in a little corner, so thanks a lot. Okay. Here, I'll use this. Okay, so the questions are, by the way, your eyes get worse as you get older. Questions are, how are we doing business back then? What were the futurists then predicting? Which predictions came true? Which predictions didn't come true? And what were the unforeseen surprises that shaped the future? But most importantly, we're here now. We heard a great presentation by a futurist. We're planning for the next 10 years, but we've done this before. And the question is, even though you think you're planning for the next 10 years, what are the surprises for people who have done this in the past? And what are the lessons learned that you need to think about when you do this going forward in the future? So first of all, let me tell you about my sources of information. I actually went and I surveyed a bunch of old guys like me. By the way, there are people in this room whose fathers I worked with. Mr. Rowland's father I worked with. Where's Phil Kerber? Is Phil here right now? Okay, he's not here today. Well, Phil Kerber's father, who's still, I think, affiliated with the Metro Parks, I worked with. And I talked to Phil Kerber's father about this kind of stuff. But I have various results of industry veterans my age. The only difference is they're all retired and I'm still doing this. I don't understand it. Pam. I didn't touch a thing. My God. All right. All right.
Good?
Well, stick around. Okay.
Whole time?
Second of all, well, actually, you can help me with this. Historical articles. I looked at historical articles and data. My own recollection. That's me recalling. Notice the phone that I'm using there, by the way. And I actually made the mistake of using ChatGPT to ask some questions and get some historical data from and maybe some images. It made my preparation time 10 times longer because every time I asked it a question, it took me down a rabbit hole, and 2 hours later, my one question was answered, and I went through hours and hours of asking a question. So, in any event, so let me set the stage. What were the 70s about? And let's just talk a little bit historically about what it was like and what the building industry was like. What did we just come through? So, you know, if you're old enough, you know, you went through the 50s and 60s. That was all about post-war prosperity. And what the building industry was doing is that was the age of modern optimism. If you look at buildings from the 50s and 60s, it was all about sleek, clean lines. It was glass. It was steel. Money was no expense. You had corporate headquarters. You had shopping malls. You didn't have any concerns about energy. You didn't have any concerns about a lot of stuff, and you had that. You get to the 60s and 70s. Now, I'm growing up now, and I'm just going to tell you, my hair is longer. You should have seen it. My habits are different. My work-life balance was very interesting when I was in college. But this was an age of social upheaval. And what was going on in architecture and design is we were into bold experimentation. This was brutalism. This was you know, downtown Cleveland. You can see a couple buildings where the new county administration building is, for example, or even the Justice Center. You have a lot of organic, interesting architecture, and this is all going on until 1973. What happened in 1973? The oil crisis. What happens in 1973 is you have the Gulf War, you have the oil crisis, and fuel prices they just go out of control. Then you have this thing called stagflation. People didn't think it could happen. You had both inflation, you had unemployment, you had a huge recession, and you had this great economic downturn that really impacted the industry. One other thing happened, though. It was the first time that you had the start of an environmental movement. First Earth Day was in 1970, then the EPA was formed. We had a river that caught fire in Cleveland, Ohio. That had some impact on all this. And so what's going on in architecture and in design is we're into this pragmatic innovation period. We're suddenly starting to think about reducing construction costs, getting some affordable materials, some energy efficiency. The nature of curtain walls is starting to change a little bit. But we are actually delaying projects in the late 70s. We're scaling back because this huge economic impact, which, by the way, kept going until 1982 when we had a big recession in 1982. But we're planning future projects. But this is the age of the 70s. So now, I'm going to take you back to this day, September 13, 1977. Who is that and what is that machine? Of course, that's Mr. Peabody, and that is the Wayback Machine. And if you're back there watching TV, you're watching Rocky and Bullwinkle, and you went back in time on the Wayback Machine. So let's take this day in 1977. Jimmy Carter was the president. Woody Hayes was the coach. Woody, because I couldn't go for three, Hayes was the coach, if you know that line. That was the day. This day was the first episode of Soap, and it was the first time people ever saw this little kid named Billy Crystal on the TV. The Atari 2600, the gaming console, came out that day. And I'm going to tell you that 2 years later, I bought this. That is an Atari 400. We're going to talk about a lot of technology here. That's the Atari 400. And I thought this was the idea of what a personal computer would be, because you could do BASIC on this little Atari 400. I don't want to trip over any of this stuff. Rocky won the Best Picture. Now, here's a trivia question. We were gearing up for the first game of an Ohio National Hockey League franchise. There was an Ohio National Hockey League franchise that played in 1977. What was the team?
Cleveland Barons.
The Cleveland Barons. You're right. It lasted all of 2 years before they went to Minnesota, and we had to wait a while before we got some NHL back. Of course, it came in Columbus. And by the way, this is not the beginning salary. The average salary of an architect engineer that year, including partners in architectural firms, was $20,000 to $25,000. So that was September 13, 1977. But now I want to do something a little more specific. I want to, who here is either a Generation Z or a millennial? My God. My God. Okay. So we're going to take, and the women in that category. Okay. We're going to take one of you, and we're going to take you back into an architect or a general contractor's office this day in 1977. You're going to be in shock. Why are you going to be in shock? Yell it. Someone yell out. Why? One of the reasons for being in shock. The only one there. That's one reason. Something else. When you walk into that office, you're going to be overwhelmed by the smoke. If anyone remembers what it was like to be in an office back then, it was unfreaking believable. 45% of the people in any one of your offices will be smoking. 20 to 25 cigarettes a day, and that's if you're lucky, because if you're in a contractor's office, it's cigars and pipes, and it is overwhelming. The smoke, it is ridiculous. You're going to ask, where are the women? And, or where are the minorities? And of course, 1 to 3% of women were architects or engineers back then, and I think the 3% is high, versus 20 to 25% and growing today. And that roughly matches the numbers of minorities at or about the same time. If you ask the question, the answer is going to be down the hall in the secretarial pool. Do you need someone to type something for you? Your response is going to be, no, but where's my computer? And of course, the answer to that is going to be, we don't have those, but here's your drafting table, here's a pencil, here's some vellum paper, get comfortable, get to work. You're going to ask about Wi-Fi, you're going to ask about how you check your emails or use your smartphone, and the answer is going to be, your mail is delivered to a pigeonhole at the rear of the office. Your phone and phone book are on your desk, and oh, by the way, I still have my phone. That is a rotary phone. Good luck trying to use it. We'll put that there. The network, of course, is just going to be a tangle of wires somewhere. You're going to ask about your 3D printer, and you're going to say, hey, if you want to make some models, there's the balsa wood, there's the X-Acto knife kit. I was going to bring my X-Acto knife kit, but I couldn't find it. You're going to look around, and you're going to see files. You're going to see papers and all kinds of stuff stuffed into a filing cabinet. You're going to ask, how did anyone find anything? And let me say, back then, about 15 to 20% of any office was files. It was storage and files, which meant you were also, if you were above the first floor, you were using structural support to support the floor. And the answer is, how do you find anything? You better remember where you put it. You better have a good filing system. You might ask, what do you do for work-life balance around here? And of course, the answer is, we work, the men, white men, work real hard, and we're going to balance it with a drink or three. As a matter of fact, the statistics back then were that 23% of people who worked back then reported drinking. I'm not talking about drinking that day. I'm talking about drinking during the work day. The 3 martini lunch was not uncommon. It was a thing back then. I was a health nut. I limited myself to 1 martini at lunch. And then the next question would be, what are you working on? And, is that an enclosed mall I see on your desk? And we're going to start the conversation. So one thing that we talked about, you heard a lot about technology and how that's changed. We didn't talk about the future of what our projects are going to be. What are we going to be working on in 10 or 15 or 20 years? So I want to start this, and I'm going to get back to the means, and I'm going to get back to the methods. I'm going to talk about all this stuff. But I want to start out by talking about what were we working on in 1977? What was the project mix, and what was actually predicted for the future? And did people actually get it right? What were the unforeseen surprises that shaped the future? And this is going to be a little small. I don't think you can read that back there. So let me tell you what it says. It starts out by talking about retail. About 15 to 20% of the work that was going on in any normal, average general contractor or architect's office in Ohio was retail. And what were you designing? You were still designing enclosed shopping malls. Randall Park Mall, the biggest mall in the world, had just opened the year before. The Galleria was being planned downtown. And then you had early big box. Who remembers Zayre's? I worked on Zayre's stores and Kmart. That was the early big box back then. What was the prediction back then? The prediction was we're going to have continued urban sprawl because we're going to have continued population growth. And of course, all retail is, you know, bricks and sticks. So we're going to have continued growth in this sector. If you want to be an architect, get into retail. Office. 20 to 25% of the work you were doing back then was office, and it was predicted to grow. And that back then we were doing high-rise. That building that you see there, if you can, that's the National City Center in Cleveland, 1980. The day I walked in the office, I was working on that project for Turner Construction Company, by the way, on contracts, to the extent we called them contracts back then, and other stuff that I was doing on that project, and claims. You know, we were planning these buildings, 77, 78. They were being built a few years later. You have some examples, and the prediction was more skyscrapers in urban centers, expansion of corporate centers and corporate campuses. Civic, institutional, I lumped that together. That was about 15 to 20% of your work and predicted once again to grow. And here you're talking about hospitals, you're talking about state buildings. There's some examples there. The state office building in Cleveland was finished in '79. But it was all predicted to grow at that point in time, particularly in the public sector and infrastructure. Housing. Housing was about 25 to 30% of the work you were doing. Now, I know a lot of people here are not involved in single-family housing, and I haven't taken it out because I couldn't find statistics that took it out. But about 60% of the work at that time was single-family, about 35% was multifamily, and this was going to be continued growth, suburban, because everyone was moving to the suburbs. It was not predicted to be continuing in urban areas because we were already seeing, at least at that time, people leaving urban areas, which meant there wouldn't be as much high-rise, but that was the prediction. And then industrial and technology, about 10 to 15% of the work, and this is all vertical work, by the way. I've not included horizontal. I've not included ODOT. This is all about vertical work. And vertical work, if I included horizontal work, this would all drop down to 70% of the total, okay? But in that realm, industrial and technology, it was auto plants, it was factories, it was manufacturing, it was all going strong. Honda in Marysville is being planned, completed in '82. All kinds of manufacturing was still going strong in Ohio. It was our strength. I was working on the period nuclear power plant at that point in time. And that's the kind of work that was being done. And the prediction is that all of it would continue to grow and all of it would be strong. What actually happened? Let's go back through. Retail, I told you it was malls and big box, about 15 to 20% of the work, the reality. The big box actually never went away. As you all know, it continued to consolidate. You know, today we have the Walmarts of the world, we have the Sam's Club, we have Target. And it survived because of the adaptation to e-commerce and their consolidated footprint, bringing in food. Malls went through initial growth from enclosed malls to regional malls to malls that had entertainment and lifestyle centers. You see some examples there, like Eatontown Center in Crocker Park. But long term, well, where are we right now? We got to what has been referred to as the retail apocalypse. You know, we have brought about by a few different surprises in the industry. So we had, what were the surprises that we couldn't have anticipated in '77? Number one, we didn't know there would be this change to experiential retail and mixed-use development. We certainly, while recessions happen, we certainly didn't know the impact of these recessions on the retail industry, but most importantly, we had no idea that we would have something called e-commerce. We had no idea of the impact of something like this, and it would have been a complete surprise, unplanned for, back in '77 or even '87, or frankly, probably a lot later than that. An example of something we planned for, have no idea what's going to happen. Office, once again, in '77, the prediction was more skyscrapers in urban centers and expansion of corporate campuses. Short term, the prediction was accurate. There was a boom in the '80s and growth in the '90s and 2000. You know, and I got to work on a lot of these projects. I was project counsel for Key Center. I represented Gil Bain on this Ohio building. Someone was talking about Ohio, or you know, and it grew, and it grew, But then the trajectory just radically changed after the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, and then particularly with the post-COVID and the shift to working at home. So just look at this difference. In 1979, the occupancy rate of offices in Ohio was 94 to 95%. Today, the average occupancy rate, depending on where you are, is probably somewhere around 80%. Columbus is doing a little better. Cleveland is doing a little worse. And this is going to continue to be a radical change. But no one had this concept in 77 or even 87 or even 2000 that we're going to have this idea of moving away from offices. So the surprises initially were the corporate consolidation and downsizing. And this follows globalization and what happens in industrial, which I'll show you in a couple minutes. The shift away from suburban offices, the decline of corporate campuses, but most important, it was the convergence of all of our technology to be able to work at home in the hybrid model, plus COVID, which drove us to work at home. Huge surprises, never would have been contemplated, whether in 77 or decades later. Huge surprise that changed everything in the industry. Once again, moving to civic and institutional, the prediction was growth in the public sector and infrastructure. And this prediction was largely accurate in the short term. As a matter of fact, universities expanded, healthcare expanded, like the Clinic campus, Wexner campus. And frankly, one of the biggest impacts of all was what at that time was the OSFC. We have some folks here from the OFCC. But the very fact of what happened with school funding. And of course, that was all about, and just to talk about the surprises, so we have the economic recessions and recoveries that have this bounce around. We have privatization of some industries and public-private partnership. But of course, with school building, that was all about the tobacco settlement, which no one knew about or could have imagined. The tobacco settlement and the governor's decision to put $15 billion into the school program, combined with this concept of having sharing between the local school districts and the states. It went on to a program. I say, Craig, I'm not saying it's over. I said 15 years here, which was to me, the major part of the program. But during that entire time frame, about 40% of the entire public spend on construction, not including horizontal, was schools. That's what it was all about. Never could have been contemplated in 77. Never would have been thought about. But this is the example of some major unanticipated thing that changes everything. And frankly, we're going to talk about this. It is probably the thing, along with Ohio State University, that finally changed project delivery in Ohio and led to construction reform in Ohio. All these events, unforeseen things, change and they work with each other. Housing. Back in 77, everyone thought that suburban sprawl and growth was just going to continue. It was all going to be about single-family housing, and we're not going to see that much development in cities because we were losing population. Interesting that if you looked at predictions, there were predictions made in 77 as to what the population would be in 2000, what the population would be now in 2025. Based on 77 predictions, we have grown at about half of the rate in population that was predicted. But when the predictions were made in 77, the prediction is that housing would have to take care of everything that went along with that population growth, right? So now we did have housing growth in the short term, and a lot of that, though, was because we had this phenomenon of subprime loans, and it was so easy to get a mortgage and to buy a house. So we did have growth in suburbs for several decades, not so much multifamily housing. But then what ultimately happened, as everybody knows, we had the housing bubble. From the Great Recession, from the whole subprime mortgage fiasco, that market tanked. But what did happen is there was at the same time an interest in revitalization of downtown. So we started getting multi-family dwelling units in downtown. We had office conversions downtown. So we did have some growth downtown in housing. Right now, it's not clear what's going to happen. Some people think suburban growth is going to start to get stronger with live-work communities because of COVID. You don't have to be downtown. Some people think downtowns are getting stronger. We certainly have a lot of buildings we could convert to housing. But the point is that we have these big surprises that once again defied industry prediction. The housing bubble and the Great Recession, interest in urban revitalization, and here's another one. If you go back to the 70s and you looked at the population growth, the growth was going to be young people. What's happened, everyone knew that there would be old people like me and that you'd need some senior communities, but what's happened now is it's mostly a lot of old people, not as many young people, so the percentage of that, which has to go to senior housing, multifamily complexes, is different than what was contemplated. And then finally, industrial and technological, what a change. We were building auto plants. We were still improving steel mills. We thought that manufacturing was going to be dominating and it was going to continue for decades. I was very involved in the nuclear power plant thing because in '77 we were going to continue with coal-fired plants, then we're going to move over into nuclear, right? What we didn't know was going to happen is that, first of all, the nuclear power industry, while we kept going, it completely stagnated because of 3 Mile Island 2 years later. That changed everything. And then we started with deindustrialization and globalization, factory closings, and it just devastated manufacturing in Ohio. It devastated factories. Now, but more recently, we now have, of course, the promise of emerging industries. I call them the centers: distribution centers, call centers, data centers, also high-tech manufacturing. We're going to see where all that goes. But the point is, back in '77, we had no idea that industry would ever collapse here. We had no idea about global competition and outsourcing. A lot of this just came a short time later. We had no idea about the environmental regulation impact and what it would have on this industry. And we had no idea about the emergence of these centers. And the whole point is, once again, in '77, we're sitting around predicting the future. We could predict none of this. So the question right now is, and we didn't talk about this, what do you think you're going to be building 10 years from now? You think you know. You think it's all about data centers and things. But what's really going to happen? And what do we really have to be prepared for? But let's move on from that to something that we've spent a little bit more time here and may be more interesting to you, which is how are we doing the work in 1977? What changes were predicted? What actually happened? What lessons did we learn? And I'm going to divide this up into a few categories that we've talked about. First of all, let's talk about design. We were hand drawing, and we were using calculators, drafting tables, T-squares, rulers, vellum paper. My slide rule, I'm going to ask some young person to use this slide rule and figure out how it works. Early calculators, I don't think people remember this, but we were using mechanical calculators, which were really weird machines. I'm going to show you one in a minute, until that Texas Instrument was invented just a few years before what I'm talking about. And people were just for the first time doing calculations on a Texas Instrument calculator. All revisions on your drawings were made with overlays and erasers. I mean, this was the state of the industry. The prediction, go back to '77 and go to a seminar, and people were talking about the idea of computer-assisted. Maybe it's something we could get into, because keep in mind, back then we didn't have any computers other than a couple big mainframes. IBM 370 was a mainframe. I'm going to show that to you, but nobody believed that computers would have, or CAD, would have any significant impact in 1977. They thought it might happen as a niche tool in some specialized industries, but computers were not expected, certainly to replace manual drawing or to have that much of an impact. Andy Couples is a great, I don't know if anyone knows him, he's from LA. He heads their whole justice division nationally. He's my age, so I reached out to Andy. You know, what actually happened, obviously we know what happened. CAD became the dominant tool by the late 1980s. But even Andy points out at that time, and he was in a major firm in LA, he said that while CAD drafting, while that was the future vision, for several years the point was if you wanted to do it on a computer when they came out, you had to buy your own computer. Firms were not supplying computers for this early on. He bought his own computer early on to try to use CAD. But of course, the developments that nobody anticipated was the concept of building information modeling. No one understood or even thought about the possible of cloud-based tools. All of that stuff was not even anyone's idea of anything that could happen. What people thought might happen is you would have a mainframe computer that maybe you could do some computer-assisted stuff, very limited and only for a major project. Never thought it would be distributed to a smaller firm or anybody else. Visualizing the design. Physical models. People still do, but spent all kinds of time with balsa cardboard. Foam was a new thing, to actually be able to use foam to cut something out. But it was all about 2D cross sections. And the prediction was no one had an idea that there would be a different way to display a design to an owner during the design phase other than a balsa model and a 2D drawing. Of course, the progress by the early 80s, we had some digital tools. AutoCAD came in 1982, followed by 3D CAD later on in the 80s. And some of that, some people thought, once again, there was some discussion of this possibility in 77. But what was a completely unexpected and a complete surprise, of course, was anything like 3D printing, anything like virtual reality or augmented reality. None of that is anything anyone had a concept of or an idea of or even thought of that as even a remote possibility in 77. So when you're in the meeting in 77, and I'm going to tell you what we were talking about, but we were not talking about any of this. It was not even on the radar screen. It was not even a thought as to something that could occur in the future. I talked a minute ago about storage. In 77, all storage was physical files and cabinets, manual retrieval, structural support. And the prediction then was that paper filing would dominate for decades. Some people thought about the possibility that the printed word, maybe there would be a way that you could store the printed word. I don't know if you remember this, but if anybody remembers, the three of you who are old enough to remember, but we had manual typewriters, then we went to the IBM Selectric, then we went to something called MAD cards. So our secretaries back then, our women secretaries back then, around 81, 82, they could type on a typewriter, and with a MAD card, it could remember the last few sentences. So it could change them. And there was this idea that maybe we could store a whole document on a computer at some point in time, but you could never store a print, you could never store a picture, you could never store anything else. That's what was being discussed back then. What actually happened, obviously, is, we had mainframe computers eventually. Eventually we got to computers. Eventually we stored things on, and we went through the floppy disks. By the way, 5 1/4, I still have a ton of them. Don't laugh. I found, this has never been opened. And let me tell you why. I remember this box because I was getting my small discs, 3.5-inch discs, right? And I went out and bought some of these probably in 2003, toward the end, by the way, of when these were available. And I made the mistake. These happened to have been Mac formatted and not PC formatted, so I couldn't use them. It's been in a drawer of mine ever since. If anyone's interested, I have boxes of these. In any event, that was our storage. Of course, what we never could have expected would be the rise of cloud storage or BIM systems. None of that on anyone's horizon. All game changers that nobody thought about. Then we get into the big topic of project communications. Once again, landline phones, the rotary phone. The best you could do on a site was a two-way radio, snail mail, couriers. If you needed to call someone from the site, you know what you did? You went and found a payphone. That's what you did. You had to go to a payphone. Think about this. You're on a construction site. You're a contractor. You have a question. You got to ask the architect. He's not there that day. Your best chance is to call someone on a hard line, hope someone answers on the other side, because pagers are still a couple years away right now. You had to hope someone was there, and then how do you communicate with them? You can't send them a drawing. You can't send them a picture. How do you get the answer back? I mean, just think about the enormous difficulty of communicating back then. Now, we did have the Polaroid XS70 camera, which had just been invented. And you could take an instant photograph, but you couldn't get it done, by the way. It was 60 seconds. That was their big thing, 60 seconds to get it done. If you were in a session like this in 1977 and you were talking about the new technological innovation, you know what you were talking about? You were talking about the fax machine. That was the new thing in 1977, and we had them. We had them. But I'm going to tell you, here were the predictions. The predictions were that we would get better fax machines. I'm going to come back to that in a second. People were talking about this concept of electronic mail, but it was way, way off. I mean, it was just this idea. And of course, even then, the network would have been a local area network. No one had a concept of what an internet would be. You knew about video phones because you saw it on the Jetsons. And so we thought that could be something that would happen. And then we talked about faster imaging because we thought about the Polaroid camera going from 60 seconds to 30 seconds on the site. Let me come back to the fax machine. So by 1981, that was the world's smallest fax machine in 1981. That is the Sharp Hi-X fax machine. It's the world's smallest fax machine. It weighs 154 pounds. It is a little phone on top of a podium. It printed 3 pages in a minute on this really funky paper, by the way. It was weird paper. And the cost to buy one of those in 2024 dollars, when it came out in 81, was $52,000 for a fax machine. And that was the technology that's going to change our industry when we talked in 1977. Of course, the other thing that we did talk about was this concept of possibly a mobile phone. People were starting to talk about it. If you remember, the original phones that we had were bag phones that you'd have in a car. The first thing that was, the first major phone that came out that people got was called the Brick. I don't know if you can see this. I know it's small. In 1983, that's the Brick. That is the Motorola phone. But what actually happened versus those predictions is, obviously, I don't have to tell you what actually happened. You all know what's actually happened with, but none of these things were expected. Email was not expected the way it came out. Video conferencing, any kind of mobile phones and small phones were not expected. And by the way, just to give you a little bit of the timeline, so here's the 70s, the landline phone, the two-way radio, the Polaroid, the fax machine is just being talked about. In the early 80s, we got the pagers, the bag phone. We start to get these early flip phones and early, well, why do I have to? Here's what you got. You got this flip phone, and you got this StarTAC. This was the coolest freaking thing. This little teeny StarTAC phone was so cool that I actually have 2 of them here. So you got that. And then the thing that you started to get, you got these things, you started to get this messaging capacity. You got things which we called PDAs. That's a PDA, a BlackBerry, or this is a Palm, and you wore it right here, and you'd get, when email finally came out, and this is still a few years later. This is actually, because you got to go to the 90s now. But you were able to get messages on these things. And this was, I mean, talk about, this technology you heard yesterday. Man, this was the stuff that, this was the technology. Oh, jeez. This was the technology. There we go, technology. I said technology and it shut it down on me because I made fun of it. All right, and of course now, in the present, I don't have to tell you about the present, when we got smartphones, cloud, tablet, video, but that's a little bit of how this emerged. You've heard, obviously, everything about the future with augmented reality and VR. I'm not here to tell you about that. You've heard about that. But the point I'm making about all this is in 1977, we had no idea what was going to happen 10 years later. You're here hearing about all this stuff and seeing all this great stuff, and you're having predictions for what's going to happen in 10 years. You don't actually know what really is going to happen 10 years out or 15 years out. We might have a better idea now, because now, by the way, we didn't have AI back then to tell us what's going to happen 10 years out. Now AI is going to tell us what's going to happen 10 years out. Let me move on to scheduling and estimating. This is my favorite topic, by the way, because I remember all this. Did anybody here know a guy named, no one here worked on, you might remember, do you remember a guy named Bob Decker? Hunt? Bob Decker, who I just was so great talking to these old guys. Bob Decker was the young the construction manager as advisor, because that's all we had, on Jacobs Field. Now, now once again, I'm plugging ahead to 1991. But he talked about his earlier years. All schedules back then were hand-drawn. And, Bob talked about the schedules he would do, because they would be, you knew about CPM, you knew about Gantt, 5,000 activity schedule. It would all be done on massive pieces of paper on a wall, just like you see these guys working here. That's what scheduling was in 1977. It was amazing. And of course, his quote here is, at the start of the project, I produced a 5,000 activity CPM schedule, hand-drawn. It was obvious that technology needed to come up with something much better. But in 1977, estimating was all done by hand. Scheduling was all done by hand. Estimating was done by hand. It was, RS means catalogs. You had cost books. You had your own company's historic data, because no one shared any historic data. So it was your own historic data. And you had just made the change. And what you see, I don't know if you can see it, up in that upper right-hand corner, that is the old form of mechanical calculator. It's not an adding machine. It's a calculator. It does calculations, but it does them mechanically. And then, of course, the TI, the Texas Instrument, that replaced it. The prediction was that we'd still be using paper processes, but there was some thought, because back then we started to see mainframe computers, the IBM 370, which took up a whole room right down there. By the way, Turner had one of these in Detroit, because I'll tell you privately about the fiasco with that computer in Detroit. But they had one of these things. It didn't work very well. But the idea was that you're going to be able to do schedules, but you know how you'd have to do them? You had to do them with punch cards. Some of you are old enough to remember punch cards. You make one mistake, your whole schedule is screwed up. That's what the technology was. But that was only going to be for the biggest projects, because only the biggest firms could afford, only the biggest firms could afford that kind of a system, right? Of course, the reality was that, eventually it was computers, getting to the PCs, getting to local area networks, and finally getting to the internet, scheduling. Software was a fiasco until 1983, when you finally got Primavera P3, which was the biggest breakthrough in the industry, by the way. Microsoft Project for small projects the next year. Estimating, until you got Timberline in the late 80s and similar programs, the same idea. But no one thought any of this stuff was going to happen in 1977. They didn't know about the idea that you could actually have personal computers and programs like we had to aid with these things. Completely unforeseen surprises were cloud platforms, mobile devices, and of course all the AI tools that we have today. Completely unforeseen. Observing and measuring the work in the field. To monitor work back then, it was all manual, right? I wish these things were bigger for you guys to see, I'm sorry. It was all these manual tools, it was tape measures, it was levels, it was plumb bobs. I didn't bring my plumb bob. Okay, I'm sorry about that. And of course the Polaroid camera, documenting it, testing. Everything was in the field. Nothing was remote. Everything had to be done there and at that point in time. The prediction in 1977, there were no changes predicted for how this was done. It's going to be paper progress logs. What were we talking about? Instant? I tell you, I go back to these seminars and it was all about getting the instant camera to get under 60 seconds. That's what it was about. The reality that no one knew about, of course, were digital tools that came about in the 90s, electronic logging, remote observation and monitoring. Andy Couples, once more, another great quote here. Now here's his concern. He says, architects, now he's an architect, are increasingly less involved in the field. When I started, we were expected to visit the site regularly, ensuring the design was executed properly. Now many rely on photos and site reports, which creates more distance. And he's concerned about the distance as you get more remote, as you do things with sensors, as you do things with, with drones. The unforeseen surprises. Are drones now being used for mapping, for aerial progress photos, real-time data collection with sensor technology, digital photography, the way we can do it now on tablets? None of this was foreseen. None of it was talked about. None of it was thought as possible way back when. This is too big a topic for right now, but I'm just going to quickly mention material systems and methods of construction. The 70s were all about steel, concrete, wood, asbestos. Big deal, asbestos in 1977. By the way, my law firm did not make money in the 70s or 80s because of the work I brought to the law firm. It made money defending asbestos cases. That's where the money was in law when this all came out and all these issues came out. But masonry, everything obviously labor intensive. The predictions, Don Dreyer helped me. He did a survey here. Don said 50 years ago, futuristic thinking in construction was influenced by the space age. Some ideas like modular construction and sustainability have become mainstream, while others like robotics and construction are still developing. This is something that is interesting. Once again, because of the Jetsons and other things, people did talk about robotics. And because of the space age, the one thing people thought in the 70s that would really revolutionize quickly was robots. And they thought that we would get further along, with modular construction. They understood that concept. That actually has not happened as fast as some people would have thought. But the predictions were, more use of, materials, plastics, synthetics, ceramics, high-efficiency materials were starting to be discussed. Prefabrication and modular construction and automation was being discussed. Sustainability was being discussed. The reality, we did make, progress in a lot of areas with our steel and concrete construction, high-efficiency materials, probably further along than we thought. Prefabrication in some sectors, but it didn't revolutionize the industry yet as expected. What was unexpected, no one knew that we were going to have the green building movement the way we did. No one anticipated LEED and what that did. No one knew that we were going to have the asbestos ban. That was a big deal. People don't realize how big a deal it was in the industry back then. Modular construction, while it grew in some sectors, it didn't dominate as predicted. Same thing with automation and robots. One thing that was unexpected, I think, a little bit has been the return of wood. We saw PLAM. If you're in Cleveland, you've seen the Intro project and other projects. And of course, no one anticipated CAD or BIM. And this is, I didn't initially have a slide about safety, but one of the biggest things that's changed from 1977 to today is you don't have a construction meeting when you don't talk about safety. So I have to have a safety slide. In 1977, it was much less regulated. OSHA was only 6 years old back then. There was PPE, we did have hard hats, we did have some fall protection, but it was all based on personal experience in a company. It was random. And there were no real standards. There was no certified training. That was just starting to come about. The prediction was that we would get improved PPE. Everyone was actually worried about what OSHA would do to the industry because they thought it would make it less efficient. But the fact of the matter is, and someone talked about this, back then the fatality rate was 25 deaths per 100,000 workers. And the injury rate was 14 per 100, reported injury rate back in 77. Look at the graphic today with the reality of greatly improved regulatory OSHA stuff with technology-driven change, and even now to some degree with drones. The reality is we've greatly improved safety, and look at the rate difference. The fatality rate is almost a third. The injury rate is almost a fifth. So we've made great strides with safety, but really the unforeseen surprise, people knew there'd be regulation. People knew PPE would get better. What they didn't anticipate was a cultural shift. They didn't anticipate that every construction meeting would start or end, or somewhere in there would be a comment about safety. They didn't anticipate, to some degree, the approved PPE, but they also didn't anticipate focus on other aspects that relate to physical safety or conditioning, focus on mental, focus on well-being. None of that was talked about or even thought would ever come into the industry back in 1977. Okay, I'm going to talk quickly about two other topics. One of them is how we were delivering projects and resolving issues in 1977. And because I lecture on this all the time, I'm going to keep this very, very brief. Obviously, in 1977, design, bid, build was 90% of the work, 90%. And even in public work here in Ohio and several other states, you had to have multiple prime. Design build was it was there, but it was very limited to niche markets, industrial, private. CM as advisor was known, but it was very, very rare, and CM at risk was just coming about, just in its infancy. There were no major changes expected, although there was a possible increase of CM as advisor. I'm sorry that Phil Kerber isn't here, because I love this quote from Dick Kerber, his dad. He said, "I was brought up in the design, bid, build world. What I always told people was that the mark of a good project manager was how to get a good job out of a bad contractor who was the low bidder," which is the mentality of what you had to do back then. Needless to say, what actually happened, it happened much faster in Ohio in the private sector. We had rapid growth of design build. That chart in the bottom right, you probably can't see it. The red line going down is design, bid, build. For construction starts over 5 million. The green line is design, build going up. And construction management hit a level and kind of stayed there. So by 2010, design build was about 40% of the market. CM at risk was about 20% of the market. And IPD was just this emerging concept. In the public sector, of course, we had to wait in Ohio. We had multiple prime. ODOT in 97 was able to get early use of design build, but it was not until construction reform when we got our alternate delivery methods. Several of us in the room, I obviously had the privilege of facilitating that. I see Craig was involved. There are a few others here that were probably involved as we walked through that, getting our other project delivery methods. The bottom, there's a nice quote from Ron Pato, who was an architect back then, now is at Panzica, about how this improved the method. But the key is the graphic on the left. Taken as a whole right now in Ohio, about 50 to 55% of work is design build. About 15 to 20% is CM at risk. About 25 to 30% is design, bid, build, and a lot of that is single family residential, and we have a smattering of IPD. That's where we are right now regionally. And by the way, here's the plug for Cogence. The plug for Cogence, if you want to learn more about these systems and come to meetings, come to Cogence meetings. We talk about this stuff all the time in different ways. Dispute resolution, one last topic here. In 1977, 90% of construction disputes were resolved through litigation. 90%. And there was a ton of it. Arbitration was rare, less than 5%. Mediation was virtually non-existent. We didn't do any partnering, we didn't know about it, we didn't have this concept of on-site dispute resolution. The prediction in 1977, and I went to these meetings, it was we're going to continue to litigate, but maybe we can find ways to streamline the litigation process. Maybe we can get court-appointed DRBs. It would always be under the court, maybe we could get a review board, a contract review board, because that just had come about in the federal in the federal system the year before, 78, or the year after. In 78, we had the Board of Contract Appeals for the first time, instead of having courts. Maybe we could have improved discovery. Maybe we could make litigation better. What actually happened, and this is why I'm a construction lawyer, because for the next 10 or 15 years, it actually got a lot worse. Litigation actually, it peaked at about 95% in the 80s. It got so expensive with discovery, with issues. It was a horrible, horrible way to get issues resolved. I made a lot of money doing it, but it was a horrible way to get things done. But by the mid-90s, there was a realization in the industry that this is no way to go. So litigation declined starting in the mid-90s. Arbitration increased. In the 90s, we were getting up to about 20% of matters arbitrated. But then what started to happen in the late 90s is people discovered mediation as a tool to get matters resolved. And ultimately, post-2000s, we've gotten to the point where litigation is now probably only 10% that go. They may start there, they don't end there. Arbitration, for the ones that actually end, 40 to 50%, but really what is growing by leaps and bounds is people realize they got to mediate their disputes, they got to use on-site dispute resolution. That's 40 to 50% and growing because the industry's gotten a lot smarter. And of course, we've reduced the number of disputes, which is the most important thing, by good process. The point being, once again, go back to 1977. What were we talking about in meetings? None of this was predicted. None of this was thought about. None of this was known. It's amazing to think about how much we didn't know was going to happen. We thought we were smart. We thought we were predicting things. We didn't have a clue. Even now, we think we're smart. We think we are predicting things. I'm telling you, you actually don't have a clue. You don't. You know, we didn't talk about climate change at all today. You don't have a clue as to how this industry is going to change, how your building is going to change, how your methods are going to change. There's great stuff out there, but you really don't know. So, one last, I got to do this one, two more, culture. What was predicted, what actually happened, what did we learn? 77, male-dominated, adversarial culture, smoky, tough environment, everything was silo, contractually, we were in our separate silos. The prediction was business as usual. We didn't talk about culture. We didn't talk about how any of this would change in 1977. Obviously, what changed was everything, more collaboration, more complex contracts, but other project delivery systems. We got into workplace wellness, the emergence of the virtual workplace, which we never thought would be a possibility for any part of this, and a complete shift in values. Which is maybe the most important thing. Don Dreyer, his quote here, there was a lot of tension between contractors and architects back in the day. Today, while contracts are more complex, there's much more emphasis on collaboration and problem solving early in the process. So lessons learned. Oh, come on. Okay, number one, futurists predict, and we had a great futurist predicting, planners have to adapt and build. The futurists are going to forecast trends, but the planners have to take the insights and they have to shape practical strategies, but they have to adapt to the unexpected. I love the quote down there by Alan Kay. He's the guy, by the way, who invented the GUI, the interface. He said the best way to predict the future is to invent it. I've always loved that quote. Second of all, technology will disrupt, but people will drive success. Technology will revolutionize construction, but it's the people who will shape the future. Don't lose sight of the human element and training of fundamentals as you adapt to digital transformations. Two quotes here. Gary Rebar, again, from Osborne. He says, there's no substitute for learning the fundamentals, how and why things work. He doesn't like AI, by the way. He says the more AI and shortcuts become the norm, the more the workforce risks losing the solid foundation of understanding how a building is truly put together. By the way, I asked AI about his criticism. I'm going to come back to that as my last slide. Rob Rayborn. You guys probably don't know Rob. He's a guy I've worked with for years. Actually, he was in Turner for a long time. You may have known Rob. Our young people rely too much on BIM to understand the actual building plans. There is no studying, getting familiar with plans like we used to, flipping between arc, structural, mechanical, electrical. That's how clash detection used to be done. And it forced engineers to get familiar with the details. They're all concerned about the disconnect between people and learning and these systems. Another lesson learned. Collaboration is key, but contracts matter. Collaboration has transformed project dynamics, but contracts still set the stage. Planners must balance relationships and risk management. The workplace is being redefined. That has been clear the whole way through. The virtual workplace and digital tools have reshaped how we work, but balancing tech efficiency with human connection, once again, that same thing, and hands-on collaboration is crucial. Well-being and exclusivity remain key. And the most important thing, expect the unexpected. The biggest lesson from the past is that the future rarely unfolds as expected. Plan for flexibility and resilience. Now, so I want to tell you that I took Gary's concern. And I did go to our friend, ChatGPT, and I said, you know, Gary Rebar said this about you, and he's very concerned about how AI is going to impact the future. What is your response? You probably can't read that, so I'll read it to you. So this is a note from ChatGPT to the construction pros of Ohio. We've looked at the past. We've seen what's been done. From paper to pixels, we've certainly had fun. Your blueprints, once drafted by hand with great care, are now rendered in 3D and float in the air. But don't fear the tech. It's not here to replace. It's here to assist you, to help set the pace. For every hard hat and tool belt you wear, AI is just a helper. We make quite the pair. Now, Mr. Rebar, don't be alarmed, and it says in parenthesis, your name rhymes with rebar, which keeps buildings armed. AI won't disrupt the solid foundation. It's here to boost innovation and creation. From scheduling woes to designs on the fly, I'm here with ideas, just give me a try. And though I'm all code and I live in the cloud, I'm proud to assist you and hope you're wowed. So let's build the future with plans and a grin. I'll help you predict it. Just tell me when to begin. So that was that was the response. My one last comment I'll make to you is, if you do a presentation like this, do not go to ChatGPT, because it's going to take you down so many wormholes, and you're going to end up staying up till 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning when you asked it one simple question, which was, when did fax machines actually come about? I'm trying to remember. An hour and a half later, you'll find out you're still in you're still in it, learning every fact about fax machines in India. So don't do that. That's my conclusion. I'm done. Thank you. I have to turn this over to Pam.
That was awesome. Like, you're so funny. And I said to him, like, don't take this stuff home. Like, why do you still have it? I don't even know. Thank you, Jeff. And what a great way to cap off our event together.